Starwalker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, a podcast all about tabletop role-playing games from the perspective of the captain's chair. Greetings, gamer, and welcome to episode 8 of the Obsidian Monolith, a podcast in which I will build a Numenera campaign from scratch. I'm your host, like Starwalker. Today, I'll discuss the conclusion of the second adventure in the campaign, as well as the Culova culture. So grab a pen, grab some paper, and get your creative juices going. It's time to create an adventure. Hello, listener. Welcome back to the show. Welcome to episode 8 of the Obsidian Monolith and episode 16 of Game Master's Journey. I'm Lex Starwalker, and I'm really excited to be doing this show today. This is the first new Obsidian Monolith I've done in a little while, a few weeks. The ones up to this point have been ones that were part of GM Intrusions. So if you remember in the last Obsidian Monolith, I talked about kind of how I set up the second adventure, which started out with a celebration of the awesomeness of the PCs for saving the town of Bone Spur from annihilation by starvation, and kind of culminated with, during this festival, one of the villagers coming up and very publicly asking the PCs for their help to go find his daughter, who had left all on her own to go into the Westwood and travel to the nearby Culova village to kind of be a diplomat and talk to them and try to improve relations between the Culovas and the humans. So that's kind of where we wrapped up last time. So I thought I would start out today telling you a little bit about this young woman. So her name is Anej Vel. She's about 20 years of age. She's got red hair, blue eyes. She's tall, thin, and pale, with an athletic build. In case anybody's going to call me out for her physical description, saying, hey, wait a minute, I thought there's no white people in the ninth world. Yeah, we're told that, but go look through the illustrations. There are white people in the ninth world. In fact, in the Numenera core book, in the section on, what's the little town they tell you about? Now I'm blanking on it. Here, let me look at my map. It's Fasten. So if you go look at Fasten, there's an illustration of a redheaded woman there. So it is totally canon to have redheads in the ninth world. So there. After a billion years of evolution, somehow the recessive genes of redheads has survived. There's another piece of weird in the world. All right. Wow. Derailing fast. So where was I? Tall and thin, pale with an athletic build. She is smart, strong-willed, and opinionated. She is direct and looks you in the eye when she talks to you. Though she's serious-minded, she has a good sense of humor if you can bring it out. She speaks Culovan and has survival and hunting skills. She is currently dressed in forest green pants, black boots, and a dark brown tank top. She is covered in sweat and dirt with twigs and leaves in her disarrayed hair. And this description has to do with kind of the state she's in when the PCs encounter her, which I'll get to, or I guess I'll get to that now. Wow, I'm really organized today. So basically, the PCs go off into the Westwood looking for her. You know, they're able to track her with a roll, and I did require a roll. And when I ran this, the particular player who made that roll, I believe it was Brian Kearns, he rolled really well. So in addition to being able to follow her trail through the woods, I told him that he could tell that she was a pretty good woodsman. And in fact, she wasn't leaving as much of a trail as most people who just blunder through the woods would. And he got the impression that if she were trying to hide her trail, or if she didn't want to be followed, he might not even be able to find her trail. But obviously she wasn't really thinking about, people following her, and she wasn't trying to mask her trail. But he could just tell with that really good roll. I think maybe he rolled a 20. He got a minor or major effect. he could tell that, she knew what she was doing in the woods, and she knew how to move through the woods without, making a ridiculously visible trail. And so that's an example of how you can use a minor or major effect and kind of give the PC a little bit more. So when they find her, they come up on a rise, and, this is heavily wooded terrain, and they look down and they see kind of down this hill, there's like another kind of like almost not really a cliff, but a very steep hill going up again. And they see her at the bottom of this hill, sitting on the ground with her back against a tree, obviously injured. And it looks like she was climbing up that slope and fell and hurt herself. And one thing that I came up with for the Westwood, for my personal ninth world, is I said that a lot of the Westwood was gallery forest, at least where the Culovas were. And if you don't know what a gallery forest is, basically, I think it was in the western part of the United States. Wow, maybe I should have looked this up because now I'm going to sound like I don't know what I'm talking about. But when I was taking anthropology classes, I learned about how some of the Native American tribes here in North America that lived in forested areas would do controlled burnings every spring, I believe, and they would basically set a fire, and this fire, they'd keep it controlled, and it would go through and it would burn all of like the underbrush and the dead leaves and things like that, but it wouldn't hurt the trees. And in fact, there were specific trees there that were not only resistant to fire, but the fire actually helped in their reproductive cycle. I don't remember exactly how it worked, but it had something to do with the heat either helped the seeds to sprout from the trees or help them to be distributed. I don't remember exactly how it worked, but the fire actually helped the trees propagate. And so what happened was the Native Americans did this every year on a regular basis. And so these forests, they were just trees. There were no, thorns or underbrush or things like that. So you could stand in one of these forests and you could look out and see quite a ways through the trees because there wasn't all this underbrush. When the European settlers came and, I'm not going to go into the horrible things that were done, but basically stole the land from the people that had been here for a long time, they no longer did this. And so what had been these beautiful gallery forests became choked with underbrush and more importantly, dead trees and fallen trees and dead bushes and things like that. And then you had the railways with coal burning steam engines, and they threw out a lot of sparks, and these sparks would hit all this dead wood and start fires. And so that's how a lot of fires were started back in those days. And again, it was because this controlled burning wasn't going on anymore. So I thought that was a really cool idea. And I liked just visually the idea of having these gallery forests where there's trees everywhere, but the ground is actually pretty clear and it's easy to travel through. And it's, you can see quite a ways, through this forest, and it's just kind of cool. So I decided that the Culovas were doing similar things. They were doing controlled burnings, and so it was gallery forest. And that was one of the things I pointed out to the PCs in the first adventure, the windmill in the woods, was in the area around the windmill, there was a lot of underbrush and stuff because the Culovas didn't go near the windmill. They didn't like it. The frequencies it put out actually gave them severe headaches. So they wouldn't go near there, and so they didn't burn in that area. So anyway, all that's kind of a huge tangent, but if you're wanting to do something in the Westwood yourself, the gallery forest is kind of a cool thing to do. So they see her, she's hurt, and when they come up to her, they find out that she's broken her leg. I had a lot of fun with this, describing a compound fracture with the tibia or shin bone actually coming out of the skin. It's pretty gruesome. And so the PCs, had to help her with that. So she is very adamant and she wants to continue to the Culova village, but obviously she can't walk. She asks the PCs to help her set and splint her leg so she can continue. And if you don't have any PCs that know how to do that, she can talk them through the process because, again, she has survival skills and things like that. If the PCs refuse to do this, she asks that they give her first aid and then go on to the Culovas themselves. So if they refuse to kind of help her get to the village in her current state, then she tries to get them to go on themselves. She insists that she'll be fine on her own until they get back if they'll just leave her with some water and some food. At this point, I'm trying to, as GM, I'm trying to anticipate, well, what might the PCs do? They might agree and say, okay, sure, and kind of split her up and help her get to the village. They might refuse to do that, but agree to go onto the village her own and leave her, to kind of fend for herself until they get back. Or they might refuse altogether and say, no, we agreed to bring you back. We're taking you back to the town. So those are kind of the three ways I kind of saw it could go. So, kind of in my prep, I came up with contingencies. So what'll happen with each of these three choices? So if they insist on taking her back to town, the whole way she's just relentlessly begging them to go to the Culovas for her, and she basically won't take no for an answer. So until they agree to either yes, we'll turn around and we'll go right now, or they agree once we get you back to town, we'll go and take care of this, she just keeps badgering them. So at this point, the GM should use all her role-playing abilities to try in character to convince the PCs through Niche how important this mission is to the town. And, she'll try everything she can think of to get them to agree. And this is a great way for you as a GM, if the PCs aren't really on board with trying to improve relations between the Culovas and the humans yet, this is a great way for you to be able to, in character through this NPC Niche, to explain to them why this is important and why this is a big deal. And she can even go into possible ramifications for if relations don't improve. What happens if things don't get better, right? Eventually something's going to happen and things are going to get worse. So something that's kind of hovering in the background that I want to talk about at this point and is affected by these three choices is what I'm planning to do next with this adventure, which is I am wanting to use a monster for Numenera from the bestiary that I'm a big fan of. I talked about it way back when in GM Intrusions. I think it might have been my first monster segment that I did. I talked about the Blood Feast Tick. And ever since I first read about the Blood Feast Tick, I've been waiting for a chance to use it. And I actually came up with this idea of how to use it way back then, and then decided to put it in the Obsidian Monolith. So I've been sitting on this encounter for a long time before I actually got a chance to run it. So the idea here is that at some point, a Niche is going to get infected by a Blood Feast Tick. And if you don't know about the Blood Feast Tick, it's basically this human-sized tick, basically, type creature that just rampages around, killing and eating everything in sight. And the way that it kind of reproduces is it has little children ticks that are actually about the size of, the way they're described, they're about the size of a deer tick, which is just like a little black speck, like you can hardly see it, right? And so these things are around a Blood Feast Tick, and if one of these gets on you, it waits until you fall asleep, and then it bites into you. It releases an anesthetic that basically kind of puts you into a coma, and it starts feeding on your blood. And over the course of, I think it's like 8 hours or something like that, it drains you of all your blood. It ends up being in this blood sac, and it grows to human size, and a full-grown Blood Feast Tick erupts from this blood sac. So I thought that was really pretty gruesome, and I thought that a fun way to introduce this monster into the game would be to have this happen to an NPC that the PCs care about. So that this NPC gets infected by one of the tiny little ticks, gets fed upon, gets drained, and then this big Blood Feast Tick erupts, and the PCs have to deal with that. So that's what I'm planning to do with the Niche. So another thing I'm trying to do as a GM with this NPC is I'm trying to make her very sympathetic, even though she's being very adamant and kind of even argumentative if the PCs don't want to go to the Culova village or don't want to take her there. I'm trying to make her likable. I'm trying to present her in such a way that even if she is at odds with the PCs, that they respect her and admire her because she's so passionate about what she believes in. And, she's right. Everything she says about the importance of this is completely true. So I'm trying to make her as sympathetic as possible so that when she ultimately dies in this very horrific way, it is very impactful to the PCs. So with each of these three options of what the PCs could do, whether they take her to the Culova village, whether they go instead, or whether they take her back to Bone Spur, I'm thinking of how am I going to work that into this thing with the Blood Feast tick. So if they choose option one and they insist on taking her back to the town, then basically she's already infected with the tick. It's already on her, and it's just waiting for the first time for her to sleep, which will be once they get her back to Bone Spur and, she goes to sleep that night. And then this event with the Blood Feast tick emerging will happen the next morning. And that's actually, well, I don't know. I kind of like all the ways that it could go for different reasons. If it went that way, it'll be fun because you'll have this Blood Feast tick rampaging through the town of Bone Spur and causing a lot of havoc, and if the PCs aren't on it immediately, probably killing quite a few townspeople. And so that'd be pretty epic to have the PCs, fighting this thing in the town, and they'll be even bigger heroes after they defeat this thing and, the townspeople see this happening in their midst. So the second way this could all go is the PCs could agree to help her get to the Culova village now. So this could happen if you have a skilled PC who can set and splint her leg, although, she would still have to be carried or maybe dragged on a litter. And this is what my PCs ended up doing. They splinted her leg, and they constructed not really a litter. I think it's called a travois. Is that what it's called? Where you it's like almost like a cot that you drag along behind you. So that's what they did. This, of course, will be an agonizing journey for her. And the PCs should be worried for her safety, as the possibility of the injury becoming worse or becoming infected is very real if they go this route. Now, this is also the way it could go if you have a PC with the Works Miracles focus who would be able to just straight up heal her, in which case, obviously she could go on her own. But one thing that I impress upon my PCs that they learned from the other people at Bone Spur is you don't travel in the Westwood by yourself. They're all about the buddy system. And this is true in any wilderness. I used to work for the Forest Service, and you don't go out where there aren't any people by yourself, because you never know what could happen. You could fall and hurt yourself like Anish did. You could get bit by a rattlesnake or a scorpion, or whatever's in the area. You could get attacked by a bear. You could get heat exhaustion. Like, all kinds of things can happen. And if you're all by yourself and something like that happens, you're pretty much fucked, right? So you want at least one other person with you just in case. So it was really foolish of her to go on her own, and that was something that I really impressed on the PCs through the NPCs in the town of Bone Spur to kind of set this up. So hopefully, they won't let her just go on her own, even if they can't fully heal her, and they'll offer to escort her. And if the PCs don't kind of figure this out, you can have Anish herself ask them to come with her, because after what's happened and, sitting for hours, with a broken leg all by herself in the woods, she's come to realize that what she did was a pretty stupid thing to do. And she's smart enough to learn from her mistakes and not want to continue on all by herself. So if this is what happens, then they arrive at the Culova village, and she very eloquently makes her case to the Culovas in the presence of the PCs, whether she's fully healed or she's on a litter or whatever. And this is a point where, you don't want, as a GM, you don't want to be, like multiple personality disorder, having this conversation between Anej, an NPC, and the Culovas, a bunch of NPCs. Hopefully one of the PCs will step forward and kind of take over making Anej's case for her. And the way I handled this, again, she was on the litter and she was, very injured and in a lot of pain. So I had her kind of start things off, and then, I just kind of impressed on the PCs how she's obviously in a lot of pain and she's really tired. And, they finally were like, hey, can we get some medical attention for our friend while we continue this discussion with you, which is what they did. So after this is all done, the Culova chief says she must discuss it with the elders and invites the visitors to stay the night, and she will give them her answer in the morning. So if this is the way things go, then the Blood Feast tick incident will likely happen in the Culova village when Anej finally does go to sleep. So if this is the way things go, this will give the PCs an opportunity to earn further points with the Culovas by helping them to defend their village from the Blood Feast tick. And then after the battle is over, they can wrap up Anej's negotiations in her honor and in her memory. So this is another way that I like that it could go, and this is the way it went in my game when I ran this. Because, again, you kind of have this battle happening amid all these civilians, for lack of a better term, all these Culovas that are non-combatant, and you have young and elderly Culovas that can't really defend themselves, and you have this tick rampaging around, and the PCs hopefully save the day. Of course, they can't save Anej, and that's too bad. And again, this was a scene that was fun to set up where, and I would recommend you do it this way, where the PCs come upon Anej right when the Blood Feast tick is quote unquote hatching from this big blood-filled sack that's filled with Anej's blood, and Anej is just kind of a drained husk. And that was kind of a gruesome and powerful moment that was kind of fun to do. So then the third way that things could go is the PCs could agree to leave Anej in the woods by herself and continue on to the village on their own. And this, I think, is the least likely of the three possibilities. I think you're only going to get this if you have, PCs that just don't give a shit about the NPCs. But in that case, why would they go on to the Culova village anyway? I think between, Anej really not wanting to be left by herself because of what happened, and just because, it would not be fun, Anej would rather that they take her with them, so she's really going to want them to take her with them. And I think the PCs are just more likely to either say, okay, yeah, we'll take you with us, or, let's get you back to the town and then we'll go on ourselves. So I think them just leaving her in the woods, it doesn't make a lot of sense, really. I mean, if the players are thinking critically at all, it doesn't really make any sense to do it that way, but they could, right? So I included it as an option. So, again, if the PCs are kind of leaning towards this, if they're talking amongst themselves and they're kind of talking about leaving her, as a GM, you should make sure to remind them just how dangerous the Westwood is, especially at night, for a lone human who can't even stand up on her own. So I think personally this is a pretty despicable option for the PCs to take, and I would let them know that. And I mean, I wouldn't say this is a despicable option, but I would make sure, that they understand that, this isn't really a cool thing to do. But if they go this way, if they choose this option, then the Blood Feast tick incident will happen the first time Anej sleeps after the PCs rejoin her. So if it goes down this way, then they're going to go on to the Culova village and all that stuff's going to happen. And then presumably they will pick Anej up on their way back to Bone Spur. So likely she will sleep once they get back to Bone Spur. Now, obviously she slept while the PCs were in the Culova village in this option. So in this option, the tick infects her sometime after she wakes up the day that the PCs come back to get her. So that's kind of the nice thing as a GM is, things that are happening behind the scenes that the PCs aren't aware of, you can kind of manipulate to fit what you want to do to how the PCs are reacting to things. So as far as the story, when the little tick infects Anish, it doesn't matter except to set it up so that the blood feast tick erupts at the time that you want it to, in the place that you want it to. And there's no way for the PCs to know. Even if they're scanning her, this thing is so small that I don't think they would detect it. It's one tiny little parasite, and your body is full of parasites all the time. So if you have a PC that starts, trying to game you and say, oh, I should have detected it because I scanned her. It's like, well, do you detect every bacterium that's living in her gut? I don't think you do. Do you detect every bacterium and other type of organism that's living on her skin? I don't think you do, So I don't think people probably, a lot of people don't realize how many organisms we have living inside and on top of our bodies, but we have more bacteria in and on us than we do actual cells. So yeah, if they are picking that up with a scan, then all those bacteria are way drowning out that one little tick. So next, of course, at some point, hopefully they get to the Culova village, and they meet the Culovas. And so real quickly, I will share with you some things I came up with for the Culova culture. So I was thinking, okay, we have these sentient spider type creatures. What would they be like? And so one idea I had that I thought would be fun to play with is how the Black Widow spider kills her mate when she reproduces. And, there are other creatures that do this, like praying mantis does this. And I thought that would be a fun thing to play with. And what would a culture of a sentient race be like where the females do this? And so I just kind of ran with that and threw in some things that I knew about from some various Native American cultures to kind of flesh it out. And that's how I came up with the Culova culture. So while the PCs are in the village, they are entertained by some Culova singers, which are 3 Culova females who sing a melancholy song. If any of them speak the language, it's about tragic lost love, which is a very popular theme in Culova culture because most love affairs of Culovas are tragic because it ends in the male's death. And they dance a strange dance that only a Culova could manage. So the Culovas have a tribal culture. They are led by a chief and the elders of the village. The chief is chosen by the elders. Culova huts are built into the trees, either into hollowed trunks of the redwood trees or in the branches of smaller trees. The huts are constructed of various materials, including wood, leaves, and spider silk. Human visitors are given freshly made hammocks of spider silk to sleep in. Culovas drink or brew a drink called kufska. This drink is made by the males of the village who sit around a large earthenware vat, chewing insects and certain sweet and sour fruits. The males spit into the vat. This is what is then fermented and then made into kufska. Kufska is about 40% alcohol by volume, which is equivalent to a lot of our hard liquors like rum and gin and vodka and stuff like that. Culovas applaud by clicking their mandibles together. The Culova language is composed of shrieks, hisses, clicks, and gestures with their front 4 legs, 2 arms and hands, and mandibles. These complex gestures are impossible for humans to make, so the version of Culovan that humans learn is akin to how Culovan toddlers speak. This has a lot to do with the Culovan perception that humans are dim-witted, simple-minded, and childlike, as they tend to sound little better than idiots when they speak Culovan. Culovas also see humans as weak and fragile because they have no exoskeletons. Humans, of course, tend to see Culovas as monstrous, horrific, and savage. Culova females eat their mates after fertilization occurs. There are no old Culova males. Culovas choose their sex when entering puberty. Most become female for obvious reasons. Males fertilize as many females as they can before getting caught and eaten. Age is a sign of status among the males, representing how many females they've evaded. Females gain status based on how many males they've eaten. The female must eat the male immediately after fertilization in order for her to provide the needed nutrients to the eggs she will lay. If she doesn't eat the male, her eggs won't hatch. The males have a much stronger sense of smell than the females do, and they can smell if an egg is fertilized or not. Now, an interesting point here is that the females don't believe the males' claim to be able to smell the difference between a fertilized and a non-fertilized egg. So the males can actually tell the difference, but the females don't believe them. Males love to eat unfertilized eggs, considering them quite tasty. If the male escapes the female's immediate and overpowering yet brief hunger, he is in no further danger from her. So kind of the way this works is the Culovas mate, and as soon as that is finished, for a very brief amount of time, like a matter of minutes, the female has this biological urge that overcomes her to eat the male. And during that time, she's kind of like, you can't reason with a female that's in that state, and she will do everything she can to eat the male, because again, if she doesn't, her eggs will not be viable. So there's kind of this brief time right after mating is done where it's like this life and death struggle between the female and the male. But if the male can avoid the female long enough for that kind of state to pass, then she kind of snaps out of it, and she doesn't want to kill him anymore. But at that point, it's too late to fertilize these eggs anymore. They've already been fertilized, but they're not gonna be viable. Culovas love their families and friends. Romantic love is a concept Culovas understand and experience, but during mating, instinctual urges are impossible to resist. Because of this, mating is seen as both tragic, because if successful, it results in the death of the male and the possible heartbreak of the female, and beautiful, because it leads to new life. Because of this, most females try to be distant and detached with their mates, and the males try to win the female's affection and love, even though the males know that the female's feelings will not affect the outcome. Deep down, they hope it will. Because of this, romantic love is idealized and romanticized, and Culovas love stories of couples who somehow overcome the mating paradox, and the female somehow avoids eating the male and yet somehow still lays viable eggs, even though no one knows of anyone this has actually happened to. If the male does avoid the female, it almost always spells the end of their relationship, as the female will resent him and blame him for the death of her children. Culova females are as heartbroken by their eggs not hatching as a human female is of a stillbirth. Because of the true love myth in Culovan culture, Culova females guard their eggs even when the male escapes, in the hopes they will hatch anyway. Male Culovas know better than to try to tell a female her eggs won't hatch. Culovas have very sensitive hearing frequencies both above and below the range of frequencies that humans can hear. Culovas highly prize skill in weaving and knitting, which they use brightly dyed spider silk for. The artisans of the village produce beautiful goods of woven cloth that are brightly colored and intricately patterned. The Culovas pride themselves on the quality of their cloth goods and the speed with which they can make them. The artisans of the village are very interested in trading their works to the humans, as they consider their creations far superior to anything humans can make, and other than textiles produced with Numenera devices in some of the larger cities, they are right about that. Culovas are very active, needing very little rest. They only rest a few hours each day, and their rest is not exactly like sleep as we mammals know it, but similar. They're still aware of their surroundings in this state, but remain completely motionless. So kind of like how fish sleep. Culovas don't blink and their eyes never close. They enjoy contests of physical speed, strength, balance, and agility. Culovas don't have any metalworking knowledge or skill, so metal goods would be an obvious choice for a good commodity that humans could trade to them. So you see here, I've kind of set up a situation where it's very possible for these two people to engage in a very profitable trade relationship, because the Culovas are able to make these textiles and anything you can imagine that could be made out of cloth via weaving or knitting or anything like that. The Culovas can make very just amazingly intricate and beautiful goods like that, and they can do it very, very quickly. But they don't have any metalworking ability. So, I've consistently described their weapons as having, stone points or bone tips and things like that. So all their weapons are made of stone and bone and wood. And so obviously they would value metal items. And so, they could trade their textiles to humans, and humans could trade metal goods to Culovas. So, there's this possibility there for a very beneficial and symbiotic trade relationship that the PCs could help bring about. And again, this rewards players who actually take time to talk to the Culova NPCs and learn all these things about their culture. And if they do so, then they will figure out that this possibility exists. So finally, I came up with some of the NPCs of the village and some names. So we have Isle, which is a Culova that the PCs interacted with quite a bit. She was one of the Culovas that they met outside of the windmill in the very first adventure. She was the one that spoke the most with the PC in my group who learned the Culova language. There is also a Culova named Isis, and she is the Culova who is able to speak the truth. And so, she can be kind of a translator for the PCs. So the way it ended up playing in my game is they actually ended up interacting with Isle more because they kind of knew her, and one of the PCs could speak Culova anyway, so they just tended to interact with Isle, and Isis tended to translate for the chief when they were interacting with the chief. And then the chief, her name is Brusca, and she wears an ornate headdress and train of woven spider silk, which is the badge of her office. She is intelligent and wise. She is a cautious Culova who is always seeking the best for her people. She is open to a closer relationship with the Bone Spurns, seeing the obvious advantages to both peoples. And then a few other names for Culova NPCs I came up with were Jairus, Quaid, and Busk, or Busk. I think it was Busk is how I pronounce that. So that's what I came up with, the Culovas and their culture. And pretty much the majority of this second adventure is the PCs finding a niche, dealing with that situation and helping her one way or another, then meeting with the Culovas, learning about them, spending a night in their village. And, I really did my best to kind of play up the alienness of the Culova village and culture. And then we have this climactic event of the Blood Feast tick erupting from Inisia's desiccated corpse, and the PCs having to deal with that. And then, of course, kind of ends on a downer because they have to go back to Bone Spur and tell Inisia's father that she's died. And, it's up to the PCs how they handle that. I think a lot of players would be, try to be nice about it and maybe not share all the gruesome details of how she died. However, one of my players, Jeremy, was playing a cruel character, and so of course he felt the need to give all the grisly details to Inisia's father, and that was awkward. I also came up with a couple optional encounters that you can do in this adventure if you want to kind of play up the danger of the Westwood and have the PCs have a couple encounters to or from the Culova village within the Westwood. So one encounter I had was an encounter with a family of ravaged bears, which the PCs stumble upon in a stream when they're crossing a stream. So there are 2 ravaged bears, and a male and female adult, and then 3 cubs that are drinking from the stream. And I was really happy with how my players handled that. They found a way to get out of there without having to fight the ravaged bears, and that was really cool. And I'm sure it was because I had the 3 cubs there. I'll bet if I would have just had 2 adult ravaged bears, they probably would have been more likely to fight them. But it was fun seeing them kind of try to get around these ravaged bears without fighting them. And of course, the male and female ravaged bears immediately were wanting to attack the PCs because they were being very protective of their cubs. And then another possible random encounter, which I think I didn't actually use, is an encounter with a vape pack. And vapes are creatures in the Numenera bestiary that are two-dimensional creatures that are pretty cool. And then, of course, you have the big combat encounter with the Blood Feast Tick. All right, that's going to wrap up the 8th installment of the Obsidian Monolith, episode 16 of Game Master's Journey. If you would like to reach me, you can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker, and you can follow me on Google+. Just search for Lex Starwalker. Please visit the website, starwalkerstudios.com. There you can find the show notes for this episode and all the other episodes of Game Master's Journey. You can also find our other podcasts. Also, you can find all kinds of links on starwalkerstudios.com, links to our Google Plus community. So please join the Game Master's Journey Google Plus community. That is the best way to know when there's new episodes, to know when I'm going to be recording live again. You can also find the live show at starwalkerstudios.com/live if you want to check out a live recording of one of my podcasts. I want to send a big thank you out to Matt DeCray, Marco Herden, Matthew Arbo, and Scott Robinson for becoming patrons of the show. Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate it. They're my first patrons on the new Patreon page for Game Master's Journey. So if you would like to support the show and keep it coming, check out our Patreon page. You can find a link to that at starwalkerstudios.com as well. And another great way that you can support this show and help new listeners find the show is to head on over to iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you get your podcast and leave us a review. I want to thank Nick Johnson, Siebharan, and Other Tim for their 5-star reviews on iTunes. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It really helps new people find the show. The more reviews, the better. And finally, a great way to support Starwalker Studios is to test drive Audible books, courtesy of Game Master's Journey. I would really suggest checking out the book Ringworld by Larry Niven. That's on Audible. If you've never read that, check it out. I just started reading it myself. It is a sci-fi classic and very, very cool book. And you could easily take the Ringworld concept and use it for a sci-fi game, or use it as a really bizarre world for a fantasy game, or use it as an alternate setting for a game like Numenera. Lots of really cool ideas in that book. And again, you can listen to it in an Audible format, courtesy of Audible Books. So head on over to starwalkerstudios.com and check the show notes. I have links to our Audible trial. You get a free 30 days from Game Master's Journey, and all the kind of details of that are there. Once again, I want to thank you so much for listening to Game Master's Journey and supporting Starwalker Studios. I really appreciate it. I'm Lex Starwalker, and game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.